this evening's speaker. John F. McManus was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in physics from Holy Cross College in 1957. He then served 3 years as an officer in the Marine Corps. In 1960, he began a career as an electronics engineer. In 1966, Mr. McManus left the engineering profession and accepted a full-time position with the John Birch Society. He has served in a variety of posts and has been the Society's chief spokesman since 1973. In June of 1991, Mr. McManus was named president of the John Birch Society. In addition to being the publisher of the New American Magazine, he is also the author of 4 books: The Insiders, Financial Terrorism, Changing Commands, and William F. Buckley, Jr., Pied Piper for the Establishment. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in extending a very warm welcome to the president of the John Birch Society, Mr. John F.
Thank you very much. That is a very warm welcome. We'll start off with a little sip of water here. While we were being led in prayer, I was thinking to myself of the story about the boy that came home from Sunday school one day, and he said to his mom, he said, "Oh boy, what a lesson they gave us there today. That was really something." And she said, "Oh, well, tell me all about it. Tell me all about it." He said, "Well, it's a story about the time that the Jewish people were being chased out of Egypt by the Pharaoh and his army, and they got up against the sea, and it was looking real bad, and the Pharaoh's army's coming down on them, so Moses got on his cell phone and he called in the Air Force, and then they sent ships across the sea, and they picked him up and took him to safety." And his mother said, Is that what they taught you in Sunday school?" Well, he said, "No, Mom, but if I told you the way they taught me, you wouldn't believe it." Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to talk about the United Nations. And we have a lot of ground to cover, so we'll get right into it. And here are the commonly held attitudes about the United Nations. We see there are people who say it's just a forum for blowing off steam. I like to use the word bloviating, right? That's what they do at the UN. And then there are other people who say, well, it never accomplished anything. And then some people say it needs to be reformed, or they ought to get better leaders. And then frequently you'll hear the fact that they feed hungry children, but the people who say that either don't know or aren't willing to say that the money that goes to feed the hungry children goes to the government in the country after country, and they skim off most of it, and then they feed a couple of hungry children and take a few pictures. So those commonly held attitudes. But there's another commonly held attitude, too. The most widely repeated pro-UN attitude is that it's a place to talk rather than fight. Now, how do you get away from that? Well, just stop and think about it. Let's suppose our country has a squabble, some sort of an issue with another country. Don't we have an ambassador in that country? And don't they probably have an ambassador in ours? Why take it to the United Nations when there's 193 people who will then be involved? Does not make it worse? And does it possibly lead to all kinds of world problems rather than just 2 countries having a problem? So that doesn't stand up either, right? It's a place to talk rather than fight? No, it's a place to get everybody involved in everybody else's business, and it usually leads to problems. Now, one of the things that's said is that, well, the United Nations never does anything, but here's the United Nations headquarters in New York City, built on land donated by the Rockefellers, which is of interest. That building is full of people, and they're not doing nothing. I can't stress that enough. They're not doing nothing, all right? Now, here's another UN building, the International Monetary Fund in Washington. There's a lot of people in that building, too. And here's another one, the International Labor Organization in Geneva. That's full of people. And here's the World Health Organization in Geneva. And here's the International Criminal Court in The Hague in the Netherlands. Right? Full of people doing something. Right? And here's the world, oh, we're back in Washington now. Here's the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Now, I haven't touched on all these buildings. The Food and Agriculture, UN Food and Agriculture, has a building in Rome. World Health Organization, Geneva, well, we touched on that. Seabed authorities in Jamaica. Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. Maritime Organization in London. Plus more agencies and organizations and buildings full of people in Tokyo and Bangkok and Montreal and Paris and Nairobi, and I didn't even name them all. Right? The UN is a massive organization of people who are doing things. And what are they doing mostly? They're building a world government. And they've got to be stopped. Right? Now the cost to the U.S. taxpayers, the contributions to the UN, $7 billion in fiscal 2010. Getting more figures, more current figures is not possible. But that doesn't count all of the extras that we put in. More money beyond that figure, more than twice that, for special programs. All right, now let's contrast the U.S. with the UN. The U.S., we started with the Declaration of Independence, and the thunderous, I really mean thunderous, assertion, men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted. Well, God's on top, according to the way our country was started. And then individuals were next with their rights and powers, and they formed governments for the purpose of doing what? Protecting their rights. That's all. Not to take care of people, not to build power over the people, just to protect their rights. That's the function of government that should be. Government should be a negative force, not a positive force. And at the end of the Bill of Rights, we see Congress shall, well, the beginning of the Bill of Rights, Congress shall make no law about speech and assembly and the right to petition and so on. Congress shall make no law. Right? That's the U.S. system. Right? It is the UN. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. And they list all of the rights that you'd like to have, and at the end they say everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. Right? And our system says Congress shall make no law. Well, then they come out in 1966 with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And they said the same thing. They listed all the rights, and then they say they may be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall be such as are provided by law and are necessary. Right? It's a total contradiction of the American system. And it's the same as what the Constitution of the Soviet Union was as far back as 1955. That's a copy of the Constitution in 1955. Same as the United Nations. People were told they had all the rights except if we pass a law, and you know how many people were free in the Soviet Union? None. So we see polar opposites. The United States believes in God. The United Nations, no God. The United States, rights come from God. The United Nations, rights come from government. The United States, no law. The United Nations, law at whim. Now we could stop right here and say, do we belong in the United Nations? And the answer is no. We never should have gotten involved in this. So part of the talk that we give here tonight is, how did we get involved? And then, of course, how do we get out? Let's go back over a little history here, and we'll see some of the human devils, I call them. You see, in the late 18th century, a man named Adam Weishaupt formed the Illuminati, and his ultimate goal was world government. And he was succeeded by an Italian, Giuseppe Mazzini. You got a problem? Did you turn it on or off? Thank you. Somebody in the back should have said something. Well, Adam Weishaupt formed the Illuminati. Incidentally, he formed it on 1776 on May 1st. And May 1st is the date that communists and socialists always celebrate their May Day. And most of them have no idea why. Right? I think there are more people in the John Birch Society who know why May 1st is a communist holiday than the communists themselves. Right? He's succeeded by Giuseppe Mazzini, who formed the Carbonari movement in Italy. And the Carbonari movement, the highest lodge of that was called the Alta Vendita. And they had instructions to their people about taking control of the Catholic Church. And their instructions said, send your people in there. Right? Don't frontally assault. Probably not too many people know that the Pope at the time was Pope Pius IX, and he was physically abused by these people. They, in fact, invaded the Vatican, and he had to escape by posing as a simple priest. And he moved south in Italy for about a year until the government took over again and put the threat down. But these people then decided that frontally assaulting the Catholic Church was a mistake, because the church only got stronger. So what they said was, send your people in there. Now, I've done a lot of study about what's happened inside the Catholic Church, and I can conclude that the sending of people in there went on from beginning in the 1850s and continues today. Right? And so it's not the Catholic Church, which was a threat to a world government, a world conspiracy, doesn't really do that anymore. So then we move on to Karl Marx, who's the father of communism and socialism. And finally we get up to the man I consider the arch conspirator of the 20th century, a man named Edward Mandell House, who was President Wilson's top advisor, was kind of like a puppet and a puppet master. But the puppet was the president and the puppet master was Edward Mandell House. And he called for a world government, but he didn't call it that. He called it a comity of nations. We don't see that word very often today, but that's what he wanted. Now here's an interesting thing, that this is from the European Union, a branch of the European Union called the European Commission. And this is a poster that they actually had. They don't have it anymore, but we did get a copy of it, and we're going to show you the rebuilding of the Tower of Babel. I think a lot of people know the story of the Tower of Babel from the Bible. It's where people tried to build a world government. And God said no. And what he did was he confused the tongues of the people so that they couldn't communicate with each other. The ones who could communicate with each other went off here and they built a nation. More over here went and built this nation. More over here built. The beginning of nationhood occurred at the Tower of Babel. And so nationhood is good. Nationhood was started by God Almighty. World government is bad. And God let us know that, and we can read about that in the book of Genesis. Now, what you see on the left here is a depiction by a Belgian artist named Bruegel, who drew that and said that that's probably what the Tower of Babel looked like. And so the European Commission, part of the European Union, went to that painting and built their own, and they're rebuilding the Tower of Babel. You can see a crane there, and you can see workmen, and so forth. And above it, you see what look like stars. They're not stars. They're pentagrams, and that's the satanic symbol. There's a whole lot that can be said about that simple poster put out by the European Union. Now, is the European Union a step toward world government? Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. But that's a very interesting thing. Now, all right, we mentioned Edward Mandell House, and here he is again. He wrote a book in 1912 called Philip Drew, Administrator. And in his book, he quoted Giuseppe Mazzini. That was the dedicatory quote, which is very significant. He became the advisor of President Wilson, and then FDR as well. He said in his book that he wanted socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, so I call him a Marxist. He despised the U.S. Constitution. He advocated income tax and the Federal Reserve, both of which we got in 1913, the first year of the Wilson administration. He proposed world government, and then he launched the Council on Foreign Relations. We'll talk a little bit about that as we proceed. So he's a very busy guy. In 1919, the U.S. Senate was asked to vote to join the League of Nations. And they debated the matter for 9 months and said no. And we should all be very grateful that the Senate in 1919 said no to a world government organization. The League of Nations was proposed by Wilson, but it was the idea of House, Edward Mandell House. Now, we're going to be talking about all different kinds of people and different organizations. You're going to say to yourself, all right, who and why and what to do about it. And here's the book I recommend. It's for sale on the book table. I've written 5 or 6 books. I would tell people, if you want to read one book to get yourself started understanding what's happening to our country, and it has happened over many years, read The Shadows of Power by James Perloff. I highly recommend it. Okay, now, we see that the U.S. Senate said no to the League of Nations in 1919, but there was all kinds of activity from 1919 up until 1941 when the UN was founded. The catalyst for speeding our country into the world government was Pearl Harbor. And that, of course, was December 7th of 1941. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, when every American was starting to think about joining the military, the guys were thinking about military activity, others were talking about mobilization, building weaponry, and so forth. The diplomats, the Council on Foreign Relations types, got together 1 month, and they issued a formal declaration of the United Nations. In 1943, the US, the UK, USSR, and China agreed to form a world government. The war is going on at this time, but these people are planning world government. 1944, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. Dumbarton Oaks is a big estate in Washington, D.C., and they created the initial draft of the UN Charter. In 1945, it was the San Francisco Conference, where 50 representatives of 50 nations got together, and they met from May, June, and into July, and they produced the final UN Charter. It was agreed upon by those 50 nations, and then it was brought back to the U.S. Senate. Now, the war in Europe ended on May 6th, 1945. Japan surrendered on August 14th, 1945, but we were already in the United Nations. We go back to 1945 and the founding of the UN, and we see that the U.S. delegation had 16 secret communists in it, including Alger Hiss, who was the chairman of the conference, the San Francisco Conference. He was what they called the Secretary General of that conference. He was later found to be a secret communist the whole time. And there were 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. That's the organization that was formed by Edward Mandell House after the U.S. Senate said no to the League of Nations in 1919. Now, the chief authors of the UN Charter were Andrei Vyshinsky of the Soviet Union, an open communist, and Alger Hiss of the United States, a secret communist. So did the communists have much to say about the founding of the UN? They had plenty to say about it. In 1945, the Senate voted whether or not the United States should join the United Nations. They debated for a mere 6 days. In 1919, 9 months, and they said no. In 1945, 6 days, and they said yes. And they approved the UN Charter with a vote of 89 to 2. Only 2 senators said no. Now, I'm old enough to remember that time. And I can remember even my own father saying, look, we already had World War I, we had World War II, we don't have World War III, we got to try something new, and that's the way it was sold. The American people were told, we need something new, something different to prevent war from ever happening again. And so 89 senators said yes and 2 said no. And I'm sure you've all heard of those 2, right? You've heard of Henrik Shipstead and William Langer. Everybody's heard of them. Henrik Shipstead was from Minnesota. And I have the speeches that they gave in 1945, and I pulled them out of the congressional record and pulled one sentence from each. He said control of the war power must remain in Congress, and he could see that it wasn't going to remain in Congress. William Langer said the UN would have the authority to send our boys all over the earth. And hasn't that happened? Those 2 men were right. Someday we should build a monument to those 2 men.
I agree.
Right? There was an American diplomat named J. Reuben Clark. He'd been an ambassador, he'd worked in the State Department, he'd done all kinds of different things. And he was a good American. He read the Charter, and he said the Charter is a war document, not a peace document. It makes it practically certain we shall have future wars. It removes power to declare wars, to choose which side to be on, to determine the equipment, and to command our sons who fight. He was right, absolutely, that he was ignored. So let's look at the Charter. Now, I have a copy of the Charter here. This is the UN Charter, and it's only a few pages, as you can see. We publish a copy of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, which is larger than this document, when you combine those 2. So Article 1 of the Charter of the UN, the word peace appears 6 times. And so the UN insists it's a peace organization. But in Article 2, it authorizes war. Article 2 discusses the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7 of the Charter. So we go to Chapter 7 of the Charter, and what do we see? We see it authorizes demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, and land forces of the United Nations. That's war. Right? So right away in Article 2, they turn away from peace and show you war. All right, now, let's suppose you're a United States Senator in 1945 and you're asked to give a vote, yes or no, to joining the United Nations. And you read through the Charter and you get to Article 25. The entire Article 25 is there. It's just a very small article. It says the members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. Would you have signed that as a senator? Doesn't that trump the Constitution? 89 senators did. I would say most of them hadn't read the Charter. There were some who read it and were very much in favor of it, some subversives, yeah. Even then there were some subversives in the Senate. But that's incredible that any senator would put his name to that. Article 43 tells you where they're going to get the forces. All members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including the rites of passage, necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. So, the United Nations passes a resolution in the Security Council, and all members of the United Nations are therefore obliged to send troops to help the UN carry out its mission. Right? Well, what happens? Most of the countries don't send any troops. The United States sends almost all of them, and the equipment. And here's Colin Powell, who was our Secretary of State, 2001. He said, with respect to U.S. policy, when it comes to our role as a member of the Security Council, we obviously are bound by UN resolutions. Now, he'd taken an oath to the Constitution. He was a general in the Army, and now he's a Secretary of State. He's taken an oath several times, and he would say that and get away with it. He should have been fired on the spot, but the people above him weren't going to fire him. That's what they want. Here's Papa Bush. It is the sacred principles enshrined in the UN Charter to which the American people will henceforth pledge their allegiance. Sacred principles? Isn't that a bit of a stretch? Now, as bad as the UN Charter was, Congress had a way of stopping this. when the United Nations Participation Act was passed in December of 1945. Now, the United Nations Participation Act, first of all, says that if the UN wants to set up a standing army, have its own troops all the time, they've never had a standing army. If the UN wants that, and any president of the United States wants to put our military guys in that circumstance, then he has to get permission from Congress. That's the first part of the UN Participation Act. This is the second part, what you see on the screen. The President shall not be deemed to require the authorization of Congress to send troops to enforce Security Council resolutions. So our troops can go, and they're not necessarily part of a UN standing army, but they're UN controlled, and they're UN, and a lot UN patches and maybe UN helmets and so forth, but they're not a standing army. They're supposedly still US forces. So that act came before the Congress in 1945. This was 6 months after the Senate had already agreed. So the United Nations Participation Act was opposed by a couple of congressmen. Here's a congresswoman, Jessie Sumner of Illinois. She was a lawyer and she was a real estate agent. And she said, this measure gives a congressional authority for surrendering the American people to an all-powerful world government. Good for you, Jessie. Right? She was spot on. There was a doctor over in Ohio named Frederick Smith, and he was a congressman. And he said this measure strikes at the very heart of the Constitution. It provides that the power to declare war shall be taken from Congress and given to the President. Here is the essence of dictatorship. Right, good. Right on. So how many do you think voted for it and against it? Sickening. The House approved it. 344, only 15. Only 15. The attitude pervaded the nation. The same attitude. We got to try something new. We got to go along with this. Right? And then the Senate approved it by voice vote. The United Nations Participation Act is almost more important than the Charter itself. Now, before we finish it tonight, we're going to get to a measure in Congress that's already been introduced. Ron Paul used to introduce it. It's now been introduced by Congressman Paul Brown of Georgia. And it's only 6 or 7 articles in the thing. It's only 3 or 4 pages. The first item in that bill is to repeal the United Nations Participation Act. Right? So I'll tell you about it before we finish, and I'll give you the piece of legislation. And I want you to write to your congressman and say, please support H.R. 75, which is what it is. Now, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio was one of my dad's favorites. My dad was a very patriotic American, and he supported the idea of the UN. I told you why. But so did Robert Taft. And Robert Taft, only 2 years later, said the UN has become a trap, let's go it alone. And he started from then on to oppose the UN in every way he possibly could. He was very embarrassed when he realized that he had made the wrong vote in 1945. Now we go back to the UN Charter, and we go to Articles 52, 3, and 4 in this Charter, and we find what are called regional arrangements. A regional arrangement is, as the Charter says, the Security Council shall utilize such regional arrangements for enforcement and action under its authority. And the Security Council shall be kept fully informed of its activities. That's where NATO came from. That's where CEDAW came from. In 1949, the Senate was asked to, and the House as well, to put the United States into NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And Secretary of State Dean Acheson, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, said NATO is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. He made it pretty clear. Now, NATO was sold to the American people as a military bloc to keep the Soviet Union from moving further west. They'd already conquered Poland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, all kinds of Romania, all those countries. And so NATO was formed, and the American people were told that NATO was to block the Soviet Union moving further west. Well, NATO is now in charge of the war in Afghanistan. Is there any wonder why we're losing? Why we're not getting anywhere? Right? But NATO is a UN operation, and it was from the very beginning, and Secretary of State Dean Acheson made that very plain. It was created in 1949. It derives its authority to exist from the UN Charter. And only 13 senators, led by Robert Taft, by the way, voted no. And NATO, now with 28 members, is in charge of the Afghan war. Okay, now we'll go to 1950 and the Korean War. In June of 1950, North Korea, communist-held North Korea, invaded South Korea, a non-communist part of that peninsula. The UN Security Council passed a measure: all members send forces. The US supplied most of the troops, and there was no declaration of war. And we slugged it out in Korea for 3 long years. We lost a lot of people. They went to President Truman, some reporters, and said, "Mr. Truman, how can you do this? There's been no declaration of war." He said, "We're not at war. This is a police action." And then he said, "If I can send troops to NATO, I can send troops to Korea." You can see how it's being used. The Korean War, UN flags were flying. In fact, General MacArthur, whom I revere, General MacArthur asked the UN to send more flags. He didn't know. He didn't know what was happening. And that state of war in Korea still exists. U.S. troops are still in South Korea. There was an armistice in 1953, but occasionally a little flare-up here and there. But this state of war still exists. At the end of the Korean War, where we had won it and then lost it, when the Chinese communists came across, General George Stratemeyer, who was one of the generals at the time, testified before the U.S. Senate, and he said, "You get into war to win it. You did not get into war to stand still and lose it, and we were required to lose it. We were not permitted to win." Douglas MacArthur, he commanded our troops in Korea, but was replaced for wanting to win. About halfway through the 3 years, he was removed and sent back home. And in his own book, MacArthur's book, Reminiscences, he quoted the Chinese general. The Chinese troops came across the border from Manchuria, and they outnumbered our troops about 20-1. And General Lin Piao stated, "I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur." All right, so who assured him that Washington would be, that General MacArthur would be restrained? The United Nations. No doubt about it. Well, another regional organization was formed called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. They call this one SEATO, S-E-A-T-O. It's a duplicate of NATO. And it was created in 1954 by John Foster Dulles. And John Foster Dulles was one of Edward Mandell House's lieutenants, and he helped John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, his brother, helped House form the Council on Foreign Relations. That I so highly recommend that book, The Shadows of Power. SEATO was cited as authorization to place U.S. troops in Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson, 1967. "We are in Vietnam because the United States and our allies are committed by the SEATO Treaty to act to meet the common danger of aggression in Southeast Asia." Right? So the UN was in control of our operation in Vietnam, because CETO was running it. Vietnam War, there were rules of engagement, keeping our troops from being able to win the war. And these rules of engagement were finally put into the congressional record by Barry Goldwater in 1985. But the rules said you weren't allowed to attack enemy planes on the ground. You would be able to attack them if they were in the air attacking you. And you couldn't go after them if they were on the ground. You couldn't attack a truck convoy if it had driven off the highway, 200 yards. They never closed Haiphong Harbor, which is where the North Koreans, the North Vietnamese got all their support, all of their equipment, most of it coming from communist Europe. And Barry Goldwater said these rules unquestionably denied a military victory. Absolutely. I had a personal thing happen not too long ago. One of my neighbors had a nice little afternoon cocktail party, and they invited my wife and myself, so we went over and I met a man who lived in New Hampshire. He was a relative of the neighbors. So I asked him, I said, well, what town do you live in? And he told me the name of the town. I'd never heard of it before. It's a little small town. He said, well, a lot of people have heard of it because Ken Burns lives there. And he said, you know who Ken Burns is? I said, well, yeah, he's the guy that makes the documentaries on the television. Ken Burns. Yeah. So I said, well, what's he up to now? He said, well, he's starting work on, he's going to do a documentary on Vietnam. And I said, oh, is that right? I said, do you suppose he has the rules of engagement? And the man said, well, what's that? So I told him what it was. And he said, well, that's very interesting. I said, if I gave you a copy of that, would you take it and give it to Ken Burns? He said, yes, I will. So I went back over to my own home, and I had 17 pages. I ran it off on a little photocopy machine I have, and I presented it to this fellow. And I got a note from him about 2 weeks later saying I met with Ken and I gave him the rules of engagement as you asked and told him what it was. So if Ken Burns does a documentary on the Vietnam War, he can use the rules of engagement if he wants to, or we'll see. I don't know. I don't know what will happen. But it just shows that you never know where you might be in a circumstance where you can do an awful lot of good.
That's true.
Okay, we move on with the wars that the U.S. has fought. We go to Desert Storm, the first attack on Iraq in 1991. And President George H.W. Bush, that's Papa Bush, the Gulf crisis has to do with a new world order. And that world order is only going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the UN proves to be effective. I don't know how many times he said New World Order. And every time he said it, he included the United Nations. So the New World Order, according to George Bush, is the United Nations taking control. There's no doubt about that. Well, Desert Storm was started because Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. And everybody went nuts. You got to stop this. So the UN passed a resolution. The United States sent troops. They went into Iraq and then into Kuwait. And as soon as they got the troops out of Kuwait, the war stopped. And people wondered why. Why didn't you go all the way to Baghdad and get Saddam Hussein, who's supposedly the bad guy? Well, the answer is that the UN Security Council authorized forcing Iraq out of Kuwait only. That's all that was authorized. And once they accomplished that, the war was over. But George Bush had said it was to strengthen the United Nations, and did it ever, right? The second Iraq war was in 2003. And here's a letter that was sent by our U.S. ambassador, John Negroponte, sent a letter to the UN Security Council. And it starts off by saying the actions being taken are authorized by existing council resolutions 678 and 687 and so forth. I have a copy of that letter. Pretty clear. So the second Iraq war was under UN as well. Right? Now let's make a principle here. Let's cite a principle anyhow. One seeks authorization from a superior, not from an inferior. Who's the superior? The United Nations. Who's the inferior? The United States. Now, I find that abominable. I hope all of you do, and I hope you want to do something about it. Right? But that's what's going on. It went on in Bosnia, it went on in Haiti, it went on in Somalia. All UN operations, all where we sent people and lost people. The Afghan war today is under NATO. There's General Petraeus before he disgraced himself. There's a body coming back, and there's our troops in the field. Right? So let's summarize the UN wars. Korean War, the UN flags were flying. There's no doubt about that one. Vietnam War was under SEATO. Desert Storm, UN authorization. Second Iraq War, UN authorization. Afghan War, NATO. Our military is a UN puppy dog. I served in the Marine Corps 1957 to 1960. I was under UN command. I didn't even know it. Nobody ever told me. We didn't have to wear UN patches or UN helmets. But we didn't do anything that the UN didn't approve or authorize. 6 months before the Second Iraq War, which started in March of 2003, so we're back to October of 2002, Ron Paul stood up at the International Relations Committee of the House, and he said, Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. What's your motion, Ron? I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But he also said, I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. Good for you, Ron Paul. So what is the chairman? The chairman of the committee was Henry Hyde of Chicago. And he said, Ron, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic. It isn't done anymore. Now, he's supposed to be a good conservative, this guy, Henry Hyde from Chicago area, right?
Ain't nothing good come out of Chicago.
Every time I think of Chicago, I think of the old guy who said one time, he says, when I die, please bury me in Chicago so I can remain politically active. There's a portion of the Constitution that says that they shall be paid compensation for their services. Do you suppose that's an anachronism? No, that's not. But that actually happened. And then that committee voted against Ron Paul's motion, which he himself voted against. They voted 45-0, right? And there was no declaration of war. In 1961, the State Department came out with a document called Freedom from War. It was also called State Department Document 7277. And it called for the gradual turnover of our military to the United Nations. It called for disarming the citizens. It said in stage 3, disarmament would proceed to the point where no state or person would have military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Right? Now that was put together by our State Department. CFR member Dean Rusk was the Secretary of State at the time. In 1962, they come out with another document called The World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. And it called for total disarmament of civilians, called for military power in the United Nations, and it ended up by saying membership in the new regime, far from being a privilege, would be mandatory. And that was written by CFR member Lincoln P. Broomfield, a professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Right? Now the gun foes, they want civilian disarmament, but so does the United Nations. The UN produced an arms trade treaty recently. The U.S. Senate said no. They voted it down. Right? There's still some resistance left. Right? Down in the lower right here, you see a picture of a pistol with the barrel tied in a knot. That is a huge statue outside the headquarters of the United Nations in Manhattan, New York City. It's about 20 feet high, 30, 40 feet long. Right? It's a huge statue. But the interesting thing about this, to signify what they want, disarmament, they don't want guns to be used for anything, is that is not a military pistol. That is a Colt revolver. That is a citizen pistol. Right? Very significant. And it was donated to them by the government of Luxembourg.
Really? Oh, nice.
Luxembourg was one of the countries that Hitler marched into, went down to City Hall, got the list of the people who had registered their weapons, and went and collected them all. Luxembourg was conquered overnight by Hitler because he confiscated the weapons of the people. And yet these people are now supporting the UN to disarm the world. What a world we live in, huh? Here's an article from the New American: Gun control misses mark. Senator Feinstein shoots off mouth, hits foot. Yeah. Isn't she a beauty? Now let's go back to the Charter. Go back to Article number 2 in the Charter. It says, nothing in the present Charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction of any state. In other words, what goes on within your borders is your business, and the United Nations has no business meddling in your affairs. But here's an organizational chart of the United Nations. I know you can't read it, but you can't find any category of life that's not mentioned in this, right? You can't find any. The UN's tentacles are in education, population, children, women, environment, trade, finance, health, agriculture, labor, military, science, culture, atomic power, telecommunications, aviation, industrial development, narcotics, refugees, property rights, and more. Right? But they can't meddle in domestic affairs. But they do meddle in domestic affairs. Okay? In 1961, the province of the Belgian Congo that had seceded, Belgium had pulled out, was now a new country. It seceded from a communist-led government, and the province wanted to start their own country. The UN invaded. They sent planes, they sent troops, they bombed hospitals, they bombed civilians, and they blew the place up smithereens. The leader of that Katanga revolt was a noble black African man named Maurice Chambé. And the doctors at the Elizabethville Hospital there, 46 of them, put out a little book immediately called 46 Angry Men, and they had pictures of the UN vehicles going through Katanga, shooting up people, and planes bombing hospitals and so forth. They sent a copy of that little book to the Pope, to every leader of European nations, and to President John Kennedy, and nothing was done. The UN, the peace organization, had showed its fangs. Right? Maurice Chambé eventually triumphed, and his Katanga province did exist for a time until he took a plane up to Europe, and the plane stopped in Algeria. He got off the plane, and he's never been seen again. In Rhodesia, they destroyed Rhodesia. It became Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe has been a disaster, a total disaster. In Australia, the UN stopped the hydroelectric power plant. In Guatemala, they demanded that they alter the Constitution to allow for abortion. The European Union has destroyed the sovereignty of 28 nations, and it's a UN operation. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank continue to finance all kinds of activity all around the globe, and they are UN operations as well. They're intervening everywhere. How about in the United States? Well, the UN has spoken out about abortion laws that still exist here in our country. They stopped a gold mine from being built in the state of Montana. They don't like the idea that we still have capital punishment. They're trying to get that really changed. They don't like our border control. I don't like it either. But they want it. They want none. They have passed judicial decisions because of treaties like NAFTA that supersede U.S. court decisions. And they want, of course, to take away the right to be armed. If they're intervening in the United States, you turn around, you're going to find a UN operation in your community. California Supreme Court judge, retired, named Frank Newman, he said, someday it will be malpractice for lawyers to fail to include UN human rights law in their cases. That's the way we're heading. Comprehensive intervening under Agenda 21. Agenda 21 came out of the Rio Conference in 1992. It's a 1,100-page book this thick, and it is an attack on property rights and a whole bunch more. It starts off with a foreword by editor Daniel Setars, and it says, Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on earth. Effective execution will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. John Birch Society decided to get involved in opposing and exposing Agenda 21 about 3 years ago. Agenda 21 is being implemented in communities across the country, cities, counties. And what happens is somebody will come to the leaders of the governmental leaders in the city or the county or some other subdivision, and they'll say, we'd like you to adopt these programs that we have here in the name of sustainable development. And if you're willing to go along with it, we can supply you with all kinds of equipment, computers and so forth, and we'll help to finance your operation. And so a lot of communities in the country, about 600 of them, jumped in. Well, the John Birch Society got involved in this. More than 100 of them had pulled out, and nobody else is joining. So much so that the New York Times ran a front-page article on a Sunday edition talking about the attack on Agenda 21 and blaming the John Birch Society, and I went, yippee! Please say it again and again and again. But this is a very, very important thing, this Agenda 21. We have information about this back on the book table. Agenda 21's stealth program. See, they don't tell you it's a UN program. It goes after property rights and family size and water rights and civil liberties and waste disposal and food and transportation, energy, education, and children. It's right across the board. As was said, profound reorientation of all human society. Here's our booklet and our DVD on Agenda 21. I recommend that you get a copy of that. Now they have a new thing that started called Common Core, Globalism for Your Children, and Common Core State Standards. This is in the educational field, and it's a UNESCO program, United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Arne Duncan, the U.S. Secretary of Education. Our goal for the coming year will be to work closely with global partners, including UNESCO, to promote qualitative improvements and system strengthening. Now, what they want to do is make education exactly the same all across the country, and they're going to tell you what the education is. If you can see the headline up there, this is the New York Times, talking about New York City. Scores on math and English tests plummet after state adopts new standards. What new standards? You see it circled. Common Core. Even in New York City, they see it now. Right? And the New York Times publishes that. We have a new DVD we call Common Core. I don't think we have them here tonight, but it's available through the John Birch Society. It's a 72-minute program by two of our experts on education telling you what's happening in the schools of America today and how it's got to be stopped. So what we see happening and planned, certainly, is reading, writing, and arithmetic is being replaced by recycling, racism, and reproduction. Right? The new 3 R's. This is a little bit hard to believe, but this man actually said this. Jacques Cousteau, the oceanographer. He says it's terrible to have to say this. World population must be stabilized. And to do that, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day. That was published in the Courrier de UNESCO in Paris. I have a copy of it. And it's a direct translation of what the man said. Now, he has contributed to that goal because he's now dead.
Joseph's son.
Here's Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society. He said, "Withdraw the United States from the United Nations and you have broken the back of the world conspiracy." And I believe that. Right? Conspiracy, you're not supposed to use the word. There's a brilliant man one time, I know this man, he said the first job of conspiracy is to convince the world that conspiracy does not exist. You speak to a neighbor, a co-worker, or maybe even a relative, and you tell them about some of the things you know, and he'll probably say, "You sound like a conspiracy theorist." Right? They've got people all across the United States saying that. Well, the response is, "No, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a conspiracy factist." Right? It's a brilliant bit of accomplishment on the part of the enemy to have people start thinking that way. And yet there are an awful lot of people who know there's something wrong, that our country's going the wrong way. But you're not supposed to say conspiracy, right? Because conspiracy means that it's happening deliberately. It's not somebody being stupid or ill-informed. Right? Conspiracy does exist. Robert Welch said, "There's a conspiracy at work as sure as there's a law of gravity." I love that summation. That puts it in very, very blunt terms. So, America's leaders are not stupid bunglers. You're going to tell me Henry Kissinger is stupid? You're going to tell me Senator Harry Reid is stupid? I don't believe that. They're also not lacking information. So if they're not stupid bunglers and they're not lacking information, what are they? They're people who know what they're doing and know what it leads to. Right? What it leads to is the destruction of the United States of America and the incorporation of our country into a world government, a world tyranny. We don't want that to happen. So let's make some conclusions. The United Nations is not taking over our country. Our country is being delivered to the United Nations. Turn that completely around. Right? Once you understand that, and as far as I'm concerned, you've got to get involved. You've got to say, "I don't want this to happen. I got children, I got grandchildren, I got nieces and nephews, I got all kinds of people that I want to see live in a free country like I've always lived in." All right. Conclusion number 2. Membership in the United Nations is completely incompatible with an independent United States and the freedom for the American people. All right. Conclusions 3, 4, and 5. Reform it.
No.
Reduce payments.
No.
Get a friendlier Secretary General. All right. What's conclusion number 6?
Get out of here.
The only sensible conclusion. That's a billboard, and it's down in Arizona. It's halfway between Tucson and Phoenix. And I was down there not too long ago, and the fellow who was driving the car or taking me, we got to that sign, I said, "Stop, please stop. I want to get out and genuflect." Wouldn't it be wonderful if those signs were appearing all over the United States?
Yes. Yes.
Well, that's a goal. That's a goal that we should strive towards accomplishing. It would really shake them up. Now, I don't have it on the PowerPoint, but I have 2 polls that were recently taken about what the American people feel about the United Nations. One poll said 70% are in favor, and the other said 70% are opposed. Take your poll. Take your pick. Take your pick. All right, I talked about this. This is the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. That's Congressman Paul Brown. He's introduced this bill. It's a measure to provide for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations. The first item is to repeal the United Nations Participation Act, and then other things. And at the end, you would have no more U.S. in the United Nations. Write to your congressman and say, I want you to support H.R. 75. Please co-sponsor it. Please do what you can to get some of your colleagues to co-sponsor it. Well, what about this John Birch Society? Well, we offer rock-solid information. We've got 5 decades of experience. We've got a sorely needed national organization and a plan for victory. The plan for victory is wake the town and tell the people. And the people will get themselves better representation in government. Now go back to number 3 on this list, national organization. That is usually just said and not even considered what it really means. When the John Birch Society got involved in the fight against Agenda 21, things started happening all across the country. Bing, bing, bing. John Birch Society gets involved in something else, things happen all across the country. Right now, Common Core. Other groups are helping too. Phyllis Schlafly and the Eagle Forum are doing a very good job on that. But when the John Birch Society gets involved, we've got people in every state. In every state, the people get involved and they start raising the ruckus. Right? We give them information, they take it, it's under their belt now, and they go out and they start spreading it, and they start getting people to understand this is the wrong way to go. Right? Maybe the New York Times will run another front page article about us opposing Common Core. I hope they do. So, the JBS plan, inform ourselves, understand the enemy, educate and activate friends, grow membership in your congressional district, train leaders, build chapters, change the voting record or change the congressman, restore constitutional government, maintain vigilance. Go back to number 2 in that list. Understand the enemy. If you believe the enemy is a bunch of bunglers, you say to yourself, well, they'll get it soon. Right? Or if you believe that they're ill-informed, you might say, well, I ought to send them a book. Right? Right? You're wasting your time. Right? You're fighting a conspiracy. And at the core of the conspiracy, there are people who know exactly what they're doing, and they have power and influence that can get all kinds of other people supporting what they want in order to help themselves to a better position, a higher salary, some recognition, some television time, whatever. Right? That's the way it works. It was Sun Tzu, the great Chinese military theoretician, way back years, centuries before Christ. He said, if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you can win 1,000 battles. But if you don't know your enemy, you're never going to win a thing. Here's a book I wrote, a little book, 45, 50 pages. The United Nations Exposed. We have them on the back of the table there. How the U.S. got in and why the U.S. should withdraw. The information that I've given you in this program is in the book, but there's a lot more besides. We also have a DVD of the speech that I'm giving you, and that's available on the book table. $2 for the DVD. Maybe you're used to paying 10 and 12 and 20 for a DVD. No. So get the book and get the DVD. The JBS motto is less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. And we certainly want that. Now let me close with a quote from President James Madison. He was the 4th president. He was the father of the Constitution. He was a pretty good thinker. And he one time registered these thoughts. It became known as the Madisonian principle. He said it's proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. And he talked about the free men of that time. The free men of America did not wait until usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise. They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle. Right? So what he's saying there is, don't wait until it's too late. He's saying, get involved while you still can make change. And we still can make change. Right? So the Madisonian principle is important. It's proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberty. The free men of America didn't wait. They denied the principle. They took appropriate action. And they started a new country. America's leaders are not stupid bunglers. They're not lacking information. Therefore, deliberate action. There's no other alternative. The deliberate action, either by determined evildoers or by their self-serving and ambition-driven followers. So those commonly held attitudes are wrong. The UN isn't a forum for blowing off steam. It's much worse than that. It's not a place where nothing was ever accomplished. I've already shown you that they've accomplished plenty. It's not that they must get better leaders. And it's not a place to talk rather than fight. The choice is ours. Less government or more government. World government. The U.S. Constitution or the UN Charter. God or no God. A better world or a new world order. That's our choice. And all of you folks, those of you who are members of the Birch Society already, thank you. I salute you. Good, keep it up. We're actually gaining. Birch Society's influence has exploded. Right? It hasn't led to membership in many instances, but it will. It will when a lot of these other organizations that have been formed go out of business, because we've been at it for 50 plus years. So to achieve victory, more members are needed. We invite everybody here, if you're not already a member, to join us. Join with us tonight. As Robert Welch said at so many occasions when he finished the speech, he said, come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. That's misspelled, isn't it? But anyhow, that's what he said. And that's what I'll say, too. Come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. And I thank you very much for your close attention through a long evening.